Good evening, everyone. It's absurd, almost suicidal. The European tower keeps getting higher, but the builders have forgotten the cement, the culture that should ensure that Europe's citizens can live and dream together. You, of course, all know these rules by heart because they are the opening words of this fantastic book we will be talking about tonight, Grand Tour Europa. And they foreshadow our faith if the demos of European democracy is not found. Without anything to hold it together, surely that great tower will fall. And that's why it's so good to see that this many people, of course, are here to talk about the future of Europe. We have fantastic speakers here tonight who will do that with us. And one is sitting next to me, Olivier Guez. Am I pronouncing your name right? Not really.
Well, in every country they pronounce it differently.
And how do you pronounce it?
No, I live in Italy now, so I say Guez. It's more Latin. In France, it's Guez. In Germany, it's Guez. In Switzerland, it's even worse. So, whatever you want.
Whatever I want.
It's fine.
I'm just going to go by Olivier, if that's okay.
Okay.
You are a writer, journalist, and screenwriter. You have published multiple works and regularly contribute to Le Monde, Le Point, the New York Times, and the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. And in 2016, you received the German Film Award for Best Script for the film The People vs. Fritz Bauer. And in 2018, your novel The Disappearance of Josef Mengele was released here in the Netherlands, also by Meulenhof. And we're going to start with you giving a short introduction, and then after that we'll invite Joris Luyendijk and Caroline de Gruyter to join us in the conversation. Two household things. This evening is live streamed, so I'm going to ask you also in a bit why you are here, what you expect of the evening, and I'm going to come towards you for questions. But then please, if you say something, don't forget that there is a live stream and that you will be visible on the website of the Bali for an eternity. So please bear that in mind. And also, if you are going to say something, then wait till I'm with you with the microphone. Otherwise, the people at home will see you for eternity, but they won't be able to hear you.
So you have to behave also, all of us. First, I'm very happy to be back in Amsterdam. I talked about Europe something like nearly 2 years ago for the French edition of the Grand Tour during the French presidency, but now I'm very happy to talk about the Dutch edition. I have to say a special thank to my publisher in the Netherlands, Meulenhof, because they are the only one who had the courage or the folly to translate this book into a foreign language. I thought that this would be published in many other European languages, but for now the Dutch is the only foreign version. So thanks a lot, Meulenhof. Short introduction. Maybe to start with my relationship to Europe. It started with as a nightmare, in fact, as a catastrophe. So I was born in Strasbourg, and in the late 70s, when I was something like 3, there used to be a swimming pool just in front of my grandparents' apartment, where I spent all my childhood. And they destructed it to build the Conseil de l'Europe, the European Council. So I started by hating Europe. They destructed my swimming pool. But then I had the chance to grow up in Strasbourg in the 80s, which I think is the best decade, in fact, for European integration, for the very idea of Europe. There was something in the air. I was a kid, I didn't know anything, I didn't know any other city, but Strasbourg was really at the center of all these European movements. Jacques Delors would come very often and would call François Mitterrand. There was, I mean, of course, the German border was always there, and we would go back and forth. I mean, again, to go swimming, because the swimming pool was closed in Strasbourg, so I had to go to Germany. And this made me not a pro-European teenager, but as a true European. And being born in Strasbourg gives you a strange relationship to France. I mean, of course, because of the history of Strasbourg, but just geographically. I mean, when you're in Strasbourg, you're closer to Milan than to Paris, for instance. You're as close to Transylvania as to Biarritz. And with the German background of Strasbourg, I've always felt better, I don't know, in Lviv, Lemberg, than in Toulouse. So basically, I was born as a European. And then I studied in England for 2 years. I spent some time in Brussels. I studied in Bruges at the College of Europe. I lived in Berlin. Now I live in Rome. So basically, I've been back and forth in Europe all of my life. And I've always been attracted and very attached to the very idea of European culture, which is different for the EU institutions or EU as it is. But I've always regretted, in fact, that the EU would dedicate so few resources and so few ideas and would lack of so much courage, in fact, to encourage the very idea of a European culture, of a European civilization, to transmit not only values, but a common history which exists, according to me. And when the French EU presidency approached, so something like 3 years ago, I went to see the Minister for European Affairs in Paris and proposed them to organize a big conference, in fact, about the very idea of European culture. Something in between what happened in the 30s, you had all this anti-fascist congress in Paris, gathering artists and intellectuals, and the Hague Congress in 1948. So, to speak about the very idea of Europe, European culture, European civilization, they wanted an object. So the only object I can build, more or less, is a book. So I came back with this idea of the Grand Tour. Basically, it's a very simple idea. I asked one writer per member state to write about a place in their own country which for them evokes European culture, European civilization, European history. Otherwise, they were completely free. They could write fiction, a non-fiction text, even a poem. And they had something like 2 months, in fact, 3 months to write the text. Most of them chose the non-fiction format. Some wrote some short stories. And I picked the writers. Some were my friends, just a few ones. Some were writers that I admired, and then I wanted them to work with me, just to give you a few names. The person I know the best in this book is the Romanian writer, Norman Manea. He's a very old guy now. He lives in New York. He's been living in New York for more than 30 years. And we know each other for more than 15 years. And his own story is the very story of Eastern Europe in the 20th century. He was born in 1936, was deported by the Romanian regime, the fascist Romanian regime, to Transnistria. Then he lived under the communists till the mid-80s. Then he managed to leave Romania, spend 1 or 2 years in Germany, then moved to the States, where he became the best friend of Philip Roth, for instance. But I wanted him to write about Romania. Some writers I admire are, for instance, Daniel Kehlmann for Germany, Sofia Oksanen for Finland, Laszlo Krasnaurkai for Hungary, Fernando Aramburu for Spain, Mélis de Kerangal for France, and so on and so on. Jan Brokken for the Netherlands. I had read this book about the Baltic states and I really loved it, so I wanted him. He's very good at non-fiction. But there were some countries where I didn't know any writer, but I had not even read a book written by a living author. So the French embassies really helped me. They always gave me a list of writers, and then I would see what they wrote, and this is how I managed to make my list of writers. I try to respect men, woman. So there are 14 men, 13 women, ladies in the book. And so this produced this book, which I think will remain as how to say, as a document about the European psyche before the Ukrainian war, because all the texts were written at the end of 21, and the book was released just at the beginning of the war. And there are a few first things I could mention about, I mean, the whole architecture of the book. That most of the texts deal with the past. All the texts from Eastern European writers deal with the 20th century. And 95% of them deal either with the Holocaust or the communist cultural genocide which happened in Central and Oriental Europe during 45 and 89. It's very different in the West. We have a very different historical perspective. I would say that most of the writers wrote about what we could call common places in Europe. Station, museums, archaeological sites, seaside resorts, thermal resorts, artist colonies like Jan Brocken or Grøndal for Denmark. And the texts in the West, written by Western writers, with the exceptions of the Portuguese, who wrote about slaves and the history of Portugal, which is very special to this issue, and the Italian one, who deals with the fascist past of Italy. But they all focused on the past. This is something strange, because they were completely free to write about anything. So there's still a big divide between the East and the West. But at the end, I would say that this book works as a kind of piazza grande of European literature. So basically, you can have a good idea of, I already said, the psyche, and the mood, in fact, the zeitgeist of Europe before the war in the Ukraine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to go maybe delve right into it, because there's something that you wrote in your introduction, and you ask two very important questions, I think. And one of the things you spoke about this also the last time you were here, and that you wonder about, is that when we decided to have the euro and to create these new banknotes, you write, why on earth, well, you don't write why on earth, but I can hear that. You write, why do we put these made-up bridges on these European banknotes? And then you ask two very important questions. You ask, are we then afraid of ourselves, our history, our identity? And I was wondering, what do you think? Are we?
I think we were, and we're still. I think we have to understand how this integration process, in fact, worked. When Western Europeans, because Eastern Europeans couldn't get access to this, but when we Western Europeans started talking about integration, so in the early 50s, it was impossible to speak about the European civilization. I mean, European civilization had led to Auschwitz just a few years before, so we had to be very modest, in fact. So the very idea of integrating economies, means of production, steel, coal, this kind of thing was very logical. And plus, we had this, we are protected by the Americans, I mean, in this context of Cold War. So the issue was not European culture, European civilization. But then I think we missed a very strong opportunity in the late 80s, early 90s, when the Berlin Wall fell. It was a huge victory for the West. But it was also a huge victory for Western values, democratic values, cultural values. And this is what Kundera writes in the Kidnapped West, I think this is the title of his book in English. What happened in Central Europe in the 50s, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it was very cultural phenomenon. people were eager to show that they were part of the West. They were part of Europe. They were not part of this Russian civilization. They had nothing to do with it. And I think the people in the late 80s, early 90s were also expecting that the Western countries, the Western population, would see them as part of this European civilization. Mm-hmm. And what we did, in fact, was we asked them to have these economic reforms, financial reforms, political reforms, judicial reforms, and that was part of the game. I mean, that was important, but that was not enough.
No.
And we stopped at that point. Because the 90s were, it was a strange time. And I think that the left and the right are responsible for this. I mean, the left was still afraid of this very idea of a European civilization.
Why?
Because of our past, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what happened during 14 and 45, because of Auschwitz, because of the colonies, because of imperialism, because basically we couldn't be proud of anything truly European. As if we could forget, I mean, what Europe also produced as fantastic values or works, mm-hmm. everything.
But that's interesting because
so that's the left.
Well, yeah, and then the right, of course.
And then, yeah, the right also. I mean, late 80s, early 90s, this is the time of the new globalization, the liberalization of services, of everything. Including culture, in fact. Mm-hmm. So they had no interest on the right to dig into this idea of civilization. This had nothing to do with the market. And the market at the time was the king of the world. I mean, the communists had been defeated. We're going to this end of history thing, liberal democracy, market democracies, and so on and so on. So basically, we left the whole European integration process into a void. Mm-hmm. And what we didn't know at the time, that this globalization process, in fact, would create such an identity angst, a true fear in every European country. So basically, this void had been filled years by the extreme right. Because they were the only one to have a discourse about identity. So the right and the left are very responsible for this. And another crucial moment, I think, was the discussions about the European constitutions in 2005. I mean, I know this, it's the French who refused, in fact, to put into the preamble of the constitution that we're part of a Judeo-Christian with Greek. I don't know exactly the precise terms, but they refused, the left in France. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, when you walk around Europe, you bump into one church after the other. When you go to a museum, I mean, it's full of works about Christ, about the very idea of Christianity. I mean, the Jewish roots are everywhere, the Greek. I mean, this is part of our culture. This doesn't mean that we're going to start a new crusade on the world because we used to be, or we have Jewish Christian roots, or that we will impose to new immigrants these beliefs or this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But this fear, in fact, of defining ourselves, I think was a huge mistake that we're still paying, in fact, everywhere in Europe, more than ever, I would say. And what happened with the banknotes is just an example of this. It's a kind of a new roses, in fact. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have hundreds, thousands of geniuses in Europe that could have put on the banknotes. What we decided to do was to design by computer bridges. Mm-hmm. How sexy. Mm-hmm. I mean, we are the only country or only monetary zone without anything on the banknote. I give another example in my introduction. This lack of symbol, this lack of means to, in fact, to be able to identify with this European adventure. In Brussels, there is a statue called L'Homme qui marche, the walking man. This is supposed to represent the European integration process. But he's like, how do you call it, a sleepless, a somnambule?
De zombie. Slaapwandelaar, sleepwalker.
Exactly. And he seems to be about to jump into the void. So we have this statue in Europe, and in the US, of course, you have the Statue of Freedom, and in every country, in fact, you have a very strong symbol. And now, I mean, considering, I mean, the whole context around Europe and what's happening, I mean, this lack of courage, this lack of, and I think that the main responsible are the member states, of course. Most of our leaders, especially in the years 2000, didn't understand, in fact, what was going on.
But is it, do you think, a sort of a refusal also to make the national symbols European?
Of course, I mean, the member states are afraid to lose...
Their national identity.
Yeah, not even this, the very idea of sovereignty. I think they still think that sovereignty is just something which belongs to the nation state, which is completely dated to the 19th century.
And then you say, so everybody who should be looking on the European identity and defining that didn't, but then you look at all these writers and everything you just said they look at is the past. How important is the past then to define what we are today?
Well, we Europeans, we have a very strong, I mean, not only Europeans, Westerners, but especially Europeans, we have a very strange relationship to past. We're obsessed by the past. I mean, just a few months ago, I think you remember, I didn't, you didn't, I think, but they released a new song of the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles got separated in 1970, 53 years ago. Can you imagine in the West, people in 1970 getting so excited because they would find a new song of a band which split in 1917? This is crazy. So we have this strong, this is also a completely neurotical relationship to the past. This is something which is also great because Europe is the only continent which really dealt with its past. It's also very dangerous because we deconstructed everything. So we Europeans, it's very difficult for us to believe in anything because, of course, we all did terrible things. I mean, the wars, of course, and colonialism, and inequalities, and so on and so on. But we're the only one who did this. So it's great for our democratic societies. And for instance, what happened in the late 60s was extremely important in Germany. It happened a bit later in France, in Italy. Never completely happened. Or in Austria, it didn't happen at all. But still, I mean, some people looked at the past. But we're completely isolated in this world. I mean, no other continent look at the past like that. And some, I mean, in dictatorships like Russia or China, they even erased the past. I mean, in China, I was in China a few years ago. When you write Tiananmen, you don't find anything on internet. Well, you find the place, the square. But 1989 doesn't exist. When you type Cultural Revolution, nothing. I mean, in Russia now, I mean, it's not now, I mean, it has been on for years, at least 10 years. They're reconstructing the image of Stalin, for instance. So on one end, this obsession with the past is remarkable, and on the other, it's extremely dangerous. And this is what you can show, you can feel in the book, that, I mean, all the texts, most of the texts are very interesting, and they deal with the past. But on the other end, we lack of energy. This is something that I could feel when I read this text. There is a melancholy, there is a kind of sadness. Well, they're writers, you couldn't expect from writers, but still, I mean, some are pretty young, or not too old, some are very old, but I mean, there is a huge range of age, I mean, among the 27 writers. So there is a nostalgia, in fact, because we Europeans, we have understood that we're not anymore the center of history, and we might be the object of history. I'm not saying the victims, but the object of history. And you can feel it in these pages, I think.
There's another question you ask right after the question that I mentioned, and that is the question, are we too lazy as well to define the culture? And I also wanted to ask you that one.
Of course we're lazy. I mean, the dreams of most of the Europeans would be a huge Switzerland.
And is that bad?
Oh, it's fantastic if the rest of the world would like to be also big Switzerland. Mm-hmm. But the problem that we're the only one who want to be a big Switzerland. You know, before coming this afternoon, I was reading a book of a chapter of Sioran, La tentation d'exister. I don't know how it's called in English. And there is a chapter about Europe. Mm-hmm. And that was written 55, 56. And basically what Sioran is writing, we can agree or not agree, that we Europeans are completely exhausted. Mm-hmm. We don't want to be part of, we don't want to be actors anymore, that we lack this energy. I mean, in 1950s, maybe it was a good sign. I mean, it was just 10 years after the European Civil War between 1914 and 1945. But this lack of energy, and also the way the EU was built. What is very important, and it's also important, of course, that the citizens of Europe are defended as consumers. We build a huge market. And I have nothing against market. We all consume, and I'm not the first one, but I like consuming too, of course, and I'm not different from anyone. But this very idea, in fact, to build a community of consumers, it says a lot, in fact, about the project and what we have in mind. I mean, I travel all around Europe, all year long. And what I see is people, villages, small towns, they want to live in peace, they want to enjoy, they want to have barbecues in the summer, they want to have holidays, they want to have a bit more money. I mean, France was paralyzed for 6 months because they would need to work, 1.5 years more or something like that. But as if France was an island. I mean, you had teenagers, people 20, 22, they would go to the streets to defend their rights for a pension at 62, in 40 years. Mm-hmm. Do you think they will get a pension at 62 in 40 years? I'm not sure. No. I'm not sure. I hope they will.
I hope so, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But, I mean, this says a lot, in fact. Mm-hmm. Of course, we're extremely lazy. And we got used to be lazy because the defense was essentially an American matter. So we could do our business together. When we don't agree, we sit all together at a table and we find compromises, and it's fantastic. But I think it's not enough in this world.
Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about this some more, but first I'm going to ask you one more question. Then I'm going towards you, because I would like to hear maybe from 3 people what you hope to hear also of the conversation about present-day Europe and what present-day Europe topics you are very interested in hearing. Then we try to touch upon them. But first, what I did not expect to happen, and that did happen when I was reading the book, because you said nostalgia, and that's fair enough, but it's also really...
You said melancholy.
Melancholy. Okay, sorry, yeah, melancholy. But it's also a very emotional book at some point, I think. And I was wondering, what were the stories that touched you the most?
I mean, of course, European history is very emotional. The Polish story, for instance.
Why?
Because I think it's very well written, it's very personal. I know the writer, it's Agata Tuszyńska. And her text is much longer than the others. She wrote a beautiful text about the ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto, and her relationship to this story and to this history and to the ghetto and her own identity and the Polish identity and the relationship between Jews and Polish people. I think it was a great text. I wouldn't say it was emotional, but the text of Kellman about this prison in East Berlin is also moving, I would say. The texts of even Eva Menace about, it's not emotional, but this relationship to the Habsburg. I think we're going to speak about the Habsburg later.
Yeah.
And so on, and other text about the slave past of Portugal, and so on and so on. So, I mean, and this is what is great with Europe, that we have all these incredible stories, and we have hundreds of writers who are able, in fact, to write, and historians, and so it is, it is moving, as you say.
Yeah, and I think you pointed out very well that it's also, and that's also what I liked. There's these, you saw a lot of things that these stories have in common, and you gave them titles, but then these titles are also scars, wounds, pain. So in a way, it's also understandable that people don't like looking back. Huh?
I mean, I composed the titles after reading the stories, of course.
Yeah.
And I was surprised that so many of them were past-oriented.
Yeah. I'm going to come briefly towards you. Please don't take too much time, and then we're going to listen to Caroline de Gruyter, and Joris Luyendijk will join us as well. But is there anyone who wants to share something that has kept him or her up at night about Europe that we really have to talk about? And if we don't, you would be really sad or enraged. Yes. Thank you.
My name is Paul Holle, and I want to start with Europe as a peace and prosperity project, and now it finds limits to growth and limits to globalization. Is Europe becoming an Austrian-Hungarian empire in the future?
Thank you.
We have a specialist in this room on that.
Thank you. Another one? Ja? Kom zo voorzichtig tussendoor, dank u wel.
Yes, thank you for sharing your really interesting story. What I was wondering is, Stefan Zweig wrote The World of Yesterday already in the 1940s, and that book kind of resembles that same nostalgia, melancholy that we're touching upon right now. But in that book, he is nostalgic about the early 20th century, maybe even the late 19th century. Do you think that nostalgia and melancholy is just part of the European identity, that we always long for the past instead of living in the current moment? And if so, what should we do about that?
Thank you. Maybe someone else? Can also, it doesn't have to be a question, it can also be a topic.
Hi, I'm Hugo Kaptein. I would really love to hear about your opinions on European arts and architecture, because this is something that I see around me every day, what we're building. And the art these days, I feel like, has very little connection to our past and to our cultural heritage as well. So I'm curious to think to what extent you also feel that that contributes to this lack of European culture within the Union.
Thank you. Prosperity, arts and architecture, and the way we're building Europe, and also the
Maybe I'm not a specialist of contemporary art, but what I'm saying, I'm not saying that we're lacking of a European culture. The European culture exists, but it's this culture has not been transmitted to the masses, I would say. It's incredible that the member states didn't have the courage, in fact, to organize a kind of maybe 1 hour a week for all the pupils and the students of Europe. I mean, to share this common heritage. You're talking about arts, but I mean, the history of arts is completely European. I mean, it's impossible to understand the Renaissance if you just deal with one country. I mean, all these artists went to Italy and some went to the Netherlands. I mean, you had all this sharing of experiences and someone copying the other and the light and so on and so on. And this has been on and on since the Roman time, in fact. I mean, the Romans invited or took the Greeks, or the Greeks went to what would become Italy, to the Roman mainlands, in fact, to copy what had been on and on in Greece for centuries. I mean, this is a completely, truly European history, and this is incredible. This is not transmitted to all the peoples of Europe. I mean, we have the bad aspects of our culture, history, and this is also a common history, I would say. I mean, the First World War, the Second World War, even if, of course, responsibilities are different and some were neutral, but it's a European history. So that's one point. So this culture exists, but no one has really taken care of it or tried to transmit it. The nostalgia thing, I think it depends on the countries, but generally in Europe, I mean, for what I can see or hear or read or the people I meet, that, I mean, Europe was the center of the world for centuries. And it's not anymore. And of course there is a kind of nostalgia. And in a country like France, which was at the center of the world for a few decades or centuries, you have a huge nostalgia for what France was. And the French are not stupid. They know it's gone. They feel it, they see it. But they still, especially the political leaders, they still do it as if France was at the center of the world. And this is true for the whole of Europe. I mean, some countries are more modest than others because of history. I mean, Germany would not boast this kind of thing as we do in France. Italy has understood for a long time that it's not at the center of the world, and when Mussolini tried to put Italy again at the center of the world, it was just a full catastrophe, in fact, for the country, and so on and so on. But this very idea to be, it's like an actress or an actor. You were at the center of attention for many, many, many years. And then you get older, you play less, you have less interest, people do things without you. This is what's happening with Europe, in fact. And so you have this kind of nostalgia. And that's the same for, I would say, for the rest of the West. In America also you have nostalgia. I mean, Trump was elected not only, but a lot because of the very idea of make America great again. So this idea of an American nostalgia of golden age, which was gone and which might come back if you vote for it. And your question, sir, was, sorry,
about European starting as a peace project and now being mostly anti-globalization and anti-prosperity project as well.
If it is an anti-globalization, or
did I say it correctly? No. Can you ask it one more time?
Sorry.
It was shorthand for limits to growth we encounter because of climate change, and limits to globalization because that is my source of unrest for right-wing sympathies. So the whole project of peace and prosperity is now finds its limits, and will it end in a kind of Austrian-Hungarian empire situation in which the center is losing its grip of the country and doesn't find the means to encounter separatism and cultural separatism?
I don't know. To be honest, I don't know. I lost my sock. I mean, the EU is a mixture of everything. It's a kind of an empire, it's a kind of a state, it's a non-state, it's an international organization. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a true state with very powerful symbolic figures that we don't have. And I haven't understood the relationship to climate change, to be honest with you. I don't know.
Maybe we'll talk about that in the panel. And now I'm going to announce Caroline de Gruyter. She's a journalist and lecturer based in Brussels. She's a European affairs correspondent and columnist for the leading Dutch newspaper NRC Handelsblad, and a regular contributor to Foreign Policy, EU Observer, and The Standard. She spent more than 20 years covering Europe from different corners of the continent. And of course, she also wrote the introductory text for this book, for the Dutch edition of this. Give her, please, a warm applause.
No. Now it does, I think. So nice that it's completely sold out tonight. That's really, it doesn't. No, it doesn't yet. Okay. Shall I raise? I'll take this one. Okay. Let me pick up on some points of what Olivier has said, and also something that struck me in the book with all these stories is how actually political the Central and Eastern Europeans were in what they wrote, and how almost non-political the Western Europeans wrote. There was a big difference. So I want to go back to the position of Central and Eastern Europe, which is interesting and which is changing a lot. You know, we might be very nostalgic in Europe towards all kinds of things, but we can do change as well. And I think we see a lot of change at the moment. And a lot of that concerns Central and Eastern Europe. Let me start with a quote from the book that you mentioned, Milan Kundera's Kidnap of the West, L'Occident kidnappé, because he wrote it in French first. A small, arch-European, super diverse Europe. He was referring to Central and Eastern Europe. A miniature model of the Europe of nations where this rule applies: maximum diversity on minimum territory. How can that Central Europe, that Central and Eastern Europe, not be horrified by Russia, which right on its doorstep has the opposite rule: minimum diversity on maximum territory? He wrote this in the early 1980s. In 1956, just before his office was razed to the ground, the director of the Hungarian news agency sent a telex out into the world. And after that, there was silence. We are dying for Hungary. We are dying for Europe. And as we know, nobody really heard him. And I think the parallel with the present is inescapable because of what happens in Ukraine. And this is propelling all the change in Europe right now. The Ukrainian president is trying to tell us exactly what the guy in Budapest in 1956 of the Hungarian news agency was trying to say. We die not just for ourselves, but for Europe. You know, you Europeans, you may piss on the technocratic and boring, in your view, Europe that you have, you know, and you keep saying you want more drama in European politics. But me, Volodymyr Zelensky, and all the Ukrainians, we want less drama. You know, we have too much politics. And our houses and our schools and hospitals are being bombed flat every day. So, you know, I would like to have more of your technocracy. I want to have more of your bureaucracy. You know, the more boring and the more technocratic, actually, the better it is. So here we have the parallel with Kundera. And if Europe, this is what he implied in 1983, if Europe does not heed this call, in this case Zelensky's call, it undermines itself. And I agree with that. But still, I lived in Central and Eastern Europe too, for a couple of years. Enough to get a little bit of the good smells. And a lot has changed in the last few years. Several things strike me. The first thing is that because of the war in Ukraine, all of a sudden, the Central and Eastern European people are arriving in Europe. Many of them have been members of the European Union for 20 years. And we kept calling them new countries for 20 years. Did we do the same with the Swedes? Did we do the same with the Austrians? I don't think so. And it really hurts them a lot. But now they've been warning us about the possible plans of Russia for a long time. And we, me included, would always say, you exaggerate. We understand your pain and your trauma. But don't exaggerate. He won't go this far. But he does. So now Central and Eastern European countries have become frontline states almost overnight. And suddenly, and I really like to say it, it gives their voices more weight in Brussels. So in a way, there are finally not new member states any longer. They're listened to, and they are a little bit more self-assured as well. Second remark is something similar, which is happening concerning the migration story. Remember the refugee crisis in 2015, 2016? Where everybody was alarmed, talking about the cleavage and East versus West again. Again, this big gap. And then came the rule of law problem, which made it even worse. East versus West. And now they took in millions of refugees. And some people say, yeah, but they're mainly women and children. They're white and they're Christian. So it's not the same as the Syrians that came in 2015. That's true, but still, they did it. And they did it without complaining. Did you know that 80% of all the Ukrainian refugees found shelter, not because the government organized it, either in Poland or in the Czech Republic and so on, but because of people who took them in and who helped them? I know a lot of Poles in Brussels who would drive back and fro over the weekend with all kinds of stuff that maybe they needed, maybe they didn't, but they really felt the urge to do something. And guess what? People I know who have been involved in the difficult negotiations on European asylum and migration policy, they tell me that, it's actually easier to talk. The conversation between Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans is easier because of this. It's still difficult. But the West has been talking about integration for a long time. We had our colonies. We've always struggled with it. We never found the right way, of course. But we're used to having this dilemma, let's call it that way. Central and Eastern Europeans didn't understand it even. So there was no discussion there. And now they grapple with the same dilemma, integration. So more shared experience than on this, actually this issue that nobody could have foreseen in 2015. What strikes me, third point, is actually that this East, if we're talking about West versus East, Eastern Europe is sort of evaporating. If Kundera was mentioning it was maximum diversity on minimum territory, lots of small language groups and nations on minimum territory. Now you find more and more that it is in the bloc. The Baltic states, they identify more and more with the Nordics. The Czech Republic is now discussing whether they will adopt the euro because they find out that they're actually totally Central European and very much hooked to Germany, also economically, but not just. Poland and Hungary usually can't stand each other, but for a while they helped each other on undermining the rule of law in Europe. But even on that, they don't see eye to eye anymore. So they're moving in totally different directions. Actually, all of them they're finding their own voices now. There is hardly any Eastern Europe anymore. So I think we should always keep reading Koudere, but we should also, I'm currently reading a book which is about this as well. It's called Goodbye Eastern Europe by a writer called Jakub Michanowski. Very interesting. I will just use a few quotes. We know Central and Eastern Europe, he writes, as a grey place where no one ever laughed. And he says, it's no wonder people want to escape being associated with Eastern Europe. And another quote, Eastern Europe is losing ground. In the past 30 years, country after country in that region has shed the label, and I very much agree with this. A final remark. People often say that Europe, and I'm not saying EU, I say Europe because I've lived in Norway and I've lived in Switzerland, and they're as much part of this entire story as we are. So Europe is like a tanker, very difficult to change, very difficult to make this tanker change direction, even a little bit. It's true, of course, everything is complicated and it takes more time, but at the same time, it's a total cliché. Europe is changing all the time. 10 years ago, we had the euro crisis. And remember, in the Netherlands, we were all speculating that we would end up with 2 euros, a euro for the north and a zero for the south. Everybody was talking about the gap between north and south. Then came the refugee crisis. We just touched on it. And all of a sudden, the big cleavage was east-west. So it was, and then maybe we'll end up with 2 Europes, but one Eastern and one Western. And now, you go fast forward, which economies are the fastest growing in Europe? We're talking about Spain, we're talking about Greece, and we're talking about Portugal. Good for them. I think this is really nice. Poland, we see now coming back in the EU core on foreign policy, but even on climate measures, and they're fully backing those again. So the cleavages in Europe are there, and they're always there, but they're never permanent somehow. And I think this is what the European tissue, and this includes cultural tissue, is all about. It is sort of a scar tissue. And it's one scar on top of another. So you have the Euro crisis scar, and then here is the refugee crisis scar. And so on every scar, new tissue is built. None of those problems and fights between European countries is ever forgotten. That's the scar. It's always visible. It's never totally healed. But all together, this forms still strong, solid, ugly, okay, but strong and solid and also very flexible tissue. And let me finish with another quote from a former British diplomat and later European diplomat, Robert Cooper. He wrote a fantastic book called The Ambassadors about the scar tissue. He doesn't call it scar tissue, that's mine, but he explains why we have this scar tissue, and I think it's great. the density of EU business, and he doesn't mean, doing business, but everything, means that national governments are in permanent negotiation with each other. One consequence is that you never know whose help you may need tomorrow. You can never break with any one country, no matter how bad your quarrel is with that country. Tonight, you may not be on speaking terms on Iraq. This was a while ago that he wrote this. But tomorrow, you will be shoulder to shoulder on, for instance, milk quotas. It's a regime of compulsory friendship. And I think this applies to culture too. And I'm very glad that what we used to call the Eastern Europeans now fully belong to this too. Okay, let me leave it there.
Thank you very much, Caroline de Gruyter. I would also quite like to ask Joris Luyendijk to join us. He has been working in journalism for the last 20 years. He has written about the Middle East, the financial sector, and specifically the City of London, and he currently focuses on populism. He has contributed to national media such as NRC Handelsblad and international media like The Guardian. And his books, Het zijn net mensen, They Are Just Like People, and Dit kan niet waar zijn, This Cannot Be True, were very well received. He is also frequently commenting on populism, Brexit and more. Brexit we probably, maybe, will get to later on. But first I wanted, Joris, also to give you the opportunity, and thank you very much, Caroline, for your beautiful short lecture, to see if there's anything in particular you want to start by reflecting on, because we haven't spoken to you yet.
Well, thank you for having me. I filled 2 pages, so now I have to choose. Would you like utopia for post-ideological atheists?
Sounds very complicated.
Not really. No, a point made during the Brexit debate by Brits, who said that these post-ideological atheists have basically nothing left to believe in, but then they can project everything they want onto Europe. That is sort of the last thing that perhaps will augur in something better, because there's nothing else they believe in anymore. I don't know why I wrote that down. The thing that struck me about what the European project needs right now is perhaps not so much to organize support, but to organize opposition. Because right now we're offered this choice between people saying there's no alternative, we just have to go forward, and people saying let's tear the whole thing down.
And then you're talking about the European Union.
Yeah, as the expression of the European project. And I think what Brexit shows you is that ultimately, in a perfect storm with the rotation of power, the people saying let's jump out are going to be in power at some point. And so if you're going to offer your electorate a choice, then it should be between different versions of the EU. Rather than to have this, either you have to go along with whatever they cooked up in Brussels, or you're a nationalist and basically you go sit with Viktor from Hungary.
I hear you're very critical about the European Union, and I also already see you frowning, Caroline.
My middle name.
Maybe
but he hasn't finished yet.
No. One more is good.
So you've got these 4 groups. They're saying, I hate the idea of the European project because I'm a small C conservative, like in the Netherlands, the SGP. And then there are the people saying, I hate the idea of the European project because I'm a fascist nationalist, like Forum for Democratie. And then there are people, I love the idea of the European project, but it will never work. And then there are people saying, I love the idea of the project, but this particular version, this EU has no future. And I think what we've done is we've just taken these 4 and just put them all together and said, okay, you're the skeptics, and so, either evil or stupid. And I think there should be a room for good faith skeptics. I'd love for this thing to work, but I really wonder how you're going to organize, for example, democratic consent and the expression of a popular will at a European level when there's no popular European public opinion. How's that going to work?
You want me to reply?
Please. If you want to. Yes.
What I see happening at the moment is that there are no 2 alternative Europes any longer. Because what you see is that the populists are stepping on the European podium. They used to rail against Europe from the national podium, which made the European podium, and everybody was always complaining about it, unused, underused. You know, there were only the center-right, the center-left, and a few other fringe parties were there. But, you know, those who are making the most noise about Europe, often against it. I mean, sometimes I would ask, are you against your country or for your country? You know, how can, it's there, how can you be against it? I mean, yes, you can change it. But because of Trump, because of Brexit, because of Putin, they have seen that it is probably smarter to stay in. And so go to Brussels and try to change Europe from the inside, which I don't like what they want to be doing with Europe. I mean, they don't even agree on many things, of course. Some are very pro-Russian, others are anti-Russian, and the list is very long, you know, and they will meet each other at the national borders as well. What you see, the populists in Austria and Italy are already, you know, fighting, verbally, of course. So what is going to happen, it has a very interesting aspect, because it means that these people, when they step on the European podium, and they're already doing it, they bring their drama, they bring their insults, they bring their emotions, everything that they only reserved for the national podium, to the European public sphere, which actually makes it much more interesting because there is some drama coming to European politics. You know, they are voting on climate laws in the European Parliament. And I mean, these are really technocratic things. And they've discussed them for years. And they are thousands of pages long, and they have like 742 amendments to deal with. And Greta Thunberg camps out in front of the European Parliament. I mean, there are all kinds of center-right members of parliament who actually want to join the far right in criticizing all that. And so there's real politics. People are yelling at each other. Actually, if you compare this to the Brussels that I knew when I started working there in 1999, when the parliament had nothing to say, and when, you know, at some point they introduced video links, because everybody was complaining, like, you know,
it's boring.
It's a black box, we don't know what's happening there. But, you know, when they had the video possibility, still nobody was looking. You see? Now people want to be looking. There is something going on. I will close. Yeah. There's one indication. A few months ago, a year before the European elections in June, they held a poll, and the results were published not so long ago. Takes time with 27 countries. They asked people if there would be European elections tomorrow, because that's another complaint. People are not voting. If there would be elections tomorrow, would you go and vote? European elections. 86% said they would go and vote, the highest ever. 5 years ago, 1 year before the elections, they did the same. It was 58%. Now it's 68%. I looked up the Netherlands, 82%. Just to say that something is changing, I think, in European politics. And it has bad sides, but I think the big democratic deficit that everybody's so used to complain about is slowly evaporating.
Just maybe to ask a few things. I agree with Caroline. I think there is a Europeanization of politics all over the continent. I think the Brexit was the best service ever given by anyone to the EU, in fact. The Brits saved the European Union. Strangely, but they did, in fact. I mean, people have understood that basically the integration went so far that it's impossible to go back where you were 30 or 50 or 60 years ago or 70 years ago. So that's one thing. But the whole thing is a paradox, because on one end you have the Europeanization of the continent politics, and on the other end the far right or the extremists have never been so strong, in fact. So on one end, you have the whole Europeanization of the continent. On the other end, this Europeanization, in fact, might have as a result in June as the rightest or the rightest parliament ever in history. So basically, the far right now, the new, but not only because, I mean, it depends on the country. But for instance, in France, the far left is as populist and as dangerous, and sometimes even more dangerous than the far right on certain issues. So all these populist things, now they've understood that the playground is Europe, that the national state is gone somehow.
I don't agree with you. I think the national states are getting more and more powerful. Also in Brussels. Everybody's getting more powerful in Brussels, and that's why it's becoming more interesting.
I agree with you, so I don't agree with me. I didn't want to mention this in that sense, not saying that the nation state is disappearing, but that they have understood that the nation state is not enough, I mean, for their political business. So do we agree?
I think if they would not have had the Europe that they have now, you know, however imperfect it is, in this mercantile world that we have, they would not survive. Look at the UK. It cannot survive on its own. Even the Americans, who were always interested in the UK because it was in Europe,
yeah.
They go straight to Brussels now, or to Paris, or to Berlin. So I think because, you know, Europe is not like a dream, or it doesn't have an ideal blueprint. It is just a way of making sure that we don't start fighting again. And so it changes. It's like a leopard, you know. It changes its skin all the time. We had for a while, Jacques Delors has just died, the old European Commission president. And under Jacques Delors, he was a very strong personality. He really had a clear vision of where to go and how to get there. It was a different time. The Commission was very powerful. Now, we get a lot more Europe, which makes the Commission more powerful. But at the same time, that lot more Europe means that Europe is not dealing with just the size of the bananas or, you know, the little screws, but with defense, with health, with security, with all kinds of issues that the member states always wanted to keep national. And now, because, I mean, they ask for it, they have to work together, because otherwise they will be wiped out by the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, and everybody else. So they do it together, but they don't want to give the power to the Commission like they did before. So they keep the fingers on the buttons in Brussels. The member states are getting a lot more power these days. A lot of things. You know, they used to take all the big decisions in Brussels and then leave it to the Commission to implement it. Now, they take the decisions and they stay on board for the implementation. So we all have vaccines because there was no other way. Mm-hmm. All the contracts that the Commission negotiates, they go to all the European capitals, and they all check those contracts. Some of them have pharmaceutical companies, and they change things in those contracts, and they make sure that, you know, with every new order, they see the contract again. This is incredible. I mean, our leaders, our national leaders who have been elected to run their country, they're basically running half of Europe now. And there are many examples. The migration deal in Tunisia. You know that this was Ursula von der Leyen. She went there together with Rutte and Meloni. So we used to say if the Commission gets more powerful, if Brussels gets more powerful, the member states lose. They get less powerful. Now they are both getting more powerful. It's a kind of the member states, I think, are more powerful than ever.
And I agree with that. I think it's the Europeanization of the whole game, in fact.
Yeah.
So everybody is getting more powerful at the European level because they've understood that the European level is the most important one, in fact.
It's inescapable, otherwise they wouldn't do it.
Exactly.
But then I'm going to ask you first, Joris, do you agree? And second, do you think that's a good or a bad thing?
Well, what really worries me is that all of this is happening over the heads of basically the entire population who have virtually no understanding of what's being done. And as long as the output legitimacy is fine and the sort of euro is stable and so on, there are no big refugee crisis, then people go like, okay, whoa. But we're transferring powers that used to have a whole structure of legitimacy around it that was, democratically grounded in a national country, and these powers just sort of float away. So you end up with these compromises that are negotiated in Brussels, and as a national country, all you can say is send them back. You say, no, we don't like this. But which immediately, upsets the whole thing, because if you want changes to the compromise, then everybody wants changes to the compromise. And so it's democratic in the sense that democratically elected parliamentarians in the end vote in favor of whatever was negotiated in Brussels. But that's something else than democracy as a sort of the expression of a popular will, if you like. And on the national level, there is this back and forth. And you don't have that on the European level. And so I was thinking, reading the book, I'm thinking, why have writers clung so much to the national? And I think it's because as a writer, if you write a book in your own country, you make an impact in that country, and there's a back and fro, and it's the media are still organized nationally, and so you can even sort of dream about perhaps someone in power reading it, or people around that person in power reading it, and there's a back and forth. If you would move to the European level, where's the echo of your work? Mm-hmm. And I think this really worries me, that we may end up with this sort of functioning structure, but it's almost entirely alien to people, and it isn't able to express what people want on the sort of level where power is exerted. So power sits at the European level, but democracy at the national level. And that's what really worries me.
Yeah. And tell me then, really concrete, what are the dangers of this?
I think that if you're going to transfer these powers, like the currency, the borders, power over the composition of your population, and people feel they have no real say in it, but they're going to have to make sacrifices. They're not prepared for these sacrifices, and then the sacrifices come. That is very, very dangerous. The French did much better, but basically the Dutch introduced the euro as if it was just some sort of new plastic little card that we're going to get. There was this Banksy flop campaign, because the most important question was, what countries can you use the euro in? Mm-hmm. But we transferred something mightily important, which was the power to set interest rates. And so there were real sacrifices involved in the introduction of the euro. We didn't prepare the population for it, and then it almost went sour with the Greek crisis, and people were utterly unprepared. If you're honest and upfront about the disadvantages, the risks of a certain step, then if they materialize, people knew what was coming. And in that sense, I think the pro and the anti-Europeans are just as deceitful, because the pro-Europeans say, let's finish this building, there won't be sacrifices. The other ones say, let's tear this building down, there won't be sacrifices. Mm-hmm. And then the status quo people say, let's keep the status quo, there won't be sacrifices. And that's why I found the Brexit campaign so disheartening, because I wish there had been a campaign saying, look, we can leave the EU and it will cost us around 4% of GDP. Is this a price you want to pay for the return of a number of powers? Because that's the deal. Instead, what they did is they lied their way, saying, actually, we're going out and it's going to bring even more money, 350 million a week for the NHS. That was so deceitful. But it's not fundamentally different from how pro-Europeans advocate Europe, which is also to suggest that this is basically sacrifice-free, risk-free. You must be an idiot to be against this.
Can I react to that? Mm-hmm. I think you have a very good point. What I found very interesting about Brexit is that the main discussion was about all these European rules that they didn't want any longer. But most of the rules are rules from the single market. Mm-hmm. Who was the most active user on the single market and who wanted to broaden it and deepen it all the time? The UK. Now, if there's any obstacle on the single market, you can go to the European Commission and ask to harmonize the rules. Guess which country used this procedure most to ask, and the Commission is obliged to follow up and to make European proposals for all kinds of, technological stuff. I mean, deeply political. The British public, this is my point, the British public didn't know this. They didn't know that it was their own government who was responsible for maybe 70% of all this European legislation. The problem in Europe is exactly as you say. Politics has remained largely national, but the issues are European, and sometimes even bigger, but we're talking about Europe, so the issues are European. The big decisions and all the moves are made by the governments who come home in their own country and never explain what they've been doing. The big black box in Europe is the Council, where the member states decide among them what the decisions are. This is a black box. I totally agree with you. And then they come back home, and if they think the people don't like it, then they will either shut up about it or they will accuse Brussels of, imposing this on them. In Italy, for instance, there are lots of European rules that are violated. For instance, a factory is dumping all kinds of poison in a river, and people get sick and people get fed up. So they complain with the government. The government, according to the rules, has the obligation to prosecute this company, to investigate and then prosecute if necessary. It doesn't do it. Why? Because if the government doesn't do it, the Commission has to do it. So it's Brussels, and then Brussels does the investigation, slams the company on the head, and it has to pay a fine, and people will blame Brussels and not the government. This, in my view, there are many problems in Europe. This, in my view, is one of the main problems. So now that the national leaders are more and more powerful in Brussels, which makes them happy no end, of course, they even have more of a job explaining. But what do? They explain less.
That's the word, explaining. And so democracy is about more than being explained, getting explained to you what has been negotiated.
Taking responsibility, that's what I mean. They have a responsibility that they don't take.
True, but even if they did, there's the problem that there's no European public opinion that can express one preference over another. And so if we move away from the technocratic and we look, for example, at euthanasia, and how over the past 30 years in the Netherlands, we've slowly come to terms with how we're going to organize death for people who no longer can or want to live. Now, how would something like that work on the European level? And how would, at some point through technology, we're going to have something as hairy, difficult, wicked as euthanasia? I can see how we did this in the Netherlands. Writers write books and the public opinion, and scientists weigh in. We have an election, we have another election. There's back and forth between the government and civil society, and so on and so on and so on.
But who says there will be a European rule on euthanasia? I've never heard of that.
No, and that's exactly my thing. If we're going to transfer more and more powers to the European level, where are we going to have these functioning debates? And
you know what? Shall I give you an example of there is an anti-corruption law in Europe that all the member states. No, that's not technocratic. Where all the member states and also the European Parliament has voted on. Long debates. Every country was involved. And that means people from all the ministries and lots of citizen groups and God knows what. After years and years, they have this law. Now, the law has to be transposed into national laws, 27 national laws. And somebody was telling me the other day, so in the Netherlands this has to happen too. And the parliament has to get involved here. And then they say, and the ministries as well say, but we can't do it this fast. And I mean, do we want this rule? They had, in every stage of the process, they were involved. But there's also very often a choice of, not getting involved, of not being interested, of letting go. And this is an issue where the Netherlands has really pushed very hard, and rightly so. Nobody can be against it. But even then, they act totally surprised when the law finally, after all these years, comes back. I mean, it's also a matter of taking up your own responsibility.
But taking it maybe a bit sort of a step back and also go a bit back to the essence of Olivier Guez's book, because what I do hear also in your story, Joris, is that you're saying we have a political European system now, but we forgot the demos and the infrastructure where European public debate would take place. And I think we can all agree that this is something that we...
I don't agree with that.
No?
We forgot the demos. I mean, there are European elections, and it's a European Parliament, and people can all vote, and they can express their opinions. So, I mean, it's truly democratic. I mean, the Council of States are composed of head of states, democratically elected in national states. So they're representing the voice of their nations. It's a weird system, but it's a kind of a democratic system. What is lacking, in fact, is a kind of pan-European media system, or a pan-European public space, in fact. But the system is democratically based. And there is a European demo. I mean, this is growing. Mm-hmm. And what is lacking with these elections, that we still have national elections for a European Parliament. We should have a European list, in fact. I mean, you should have the Conservative with a Dutch and a French and a Greek and a Portuguese, and with the same list everywhere. That would be a truly European Parliament election. This might come, this might not come. I have no idea.
Do you know who blocked it? Sorry, just...
No.
The member states?
Of course, like everything.
It's the governments again. Yeah.
The member states, they play this dangerous game, in fact. But I mean, for ages, for decades. So I'm sorry, but
that's okay.
We can't say. I'm not a pro-European. I feel very European. Mm-hmm. I'm more European than anything else. But there is a demo in Europe. There is a demo.
Do you agree?
Well, when I was working at The Guardian, there was this really strong ambition of The Guardian turning into sort of the place where that demo would have its would hash out the arguments, and it proved to be so incredibly difficult to write pieces that would resonate from, say, from Romania to Finland to Portugal. And I think it was around fighting terrorism, which was a sort of a shared threat that became sort of possible, but we discovered we basically lacked the vocabulary. And I think this is where writers like us have so far really let the European public down, that we haven't developed the sort of terminology with which we could discuss these things.
Because, again, the member states, it's very difficult to be European. I can speak for myself. I mean, I'm as an independent writer. You have no idea. I mean, to move from France to Italy, how difficult it is from an administrative point of view, from a pension point of view, from a security system point of view. It's crazy. I live in a gray zone. I don't know exactly to which systems I belong, and it's crazy. This is Europe.
I agree.
I mean, this Europe was made for the big multinational firms, and then you can move your employee from one place to the other, and that's fine and that's easy. But as an independent, and that's one of the big difference with America. I mean, in America, you can move from New York to LA, from LA to Florida, and so on and so on. This is a nightmare. So basically, to be European, to live as a European, remains extremely difficult, if not impossible, actually. And we are very few truly true Europeans just because the system makes it impossible.
But we still make our living as writers uniquely from the national. So you're offering articles to national newspapers. You're offering your book to national publishers. So there just isn't.
Yeah, but the thing is, you're being translated. I mean, there is, when you open any literary pages in Europe, I mean, you have European writers, thanks God. And for instance, the writers I worked with, the thing I ask them, because some ask me, should we write something, an essay about Europe or the EU? I said, no, I don't want anything about the EU. I don't care if you're pro-EU or against EU, pro-Euro or against Euro. I don't care. What I want the flesh of Europe. I want the histories about Europe. I want characters, faces, landscapes. For me, this is Europe, and this is what the EU has completely forgotten. And this is what is still lacking. And this book is a very, very, very little stone on, I don't know, a tower which might never be built. But I mean, Europe, not as a political construction, but as an object, even as a kind of object of desire, is amazingly sexy when you think about it. I mean, just think about the landscapes of Europe, the architecture of Europe, the art history of Europe, the cuisine of Europe. People like it. People move from one place to the other. I mean, they go on holidays. The airports are full of people, far too full of people now. But this is what is lacking.
But Olivier, Olivier,
Caroline.
When you go to a museum
Yes.
in Amsterdam or in Brussels or in Paris or in Rome, even in Rome, most of the exhibitions involve foreign artists.
Yeah.
My book is being translated in several languages. So I discover sort of a cultural life in Europe because I go to all kinds of obscure literary festivals and book fairs and so on. And then, it takes you 1 day and a half to get there and then 1 day and a half back. And you do a few talks. It's totally run by just people in a small town.
This is what I'm saying.
Who don't get any money for it and who love it, really.
I presented the book in 15 European countries.
It's a warm bath.
Yes, it's...
Yes, so that's European.
It is, absolutely.
It is. We don't need the government, we don't need the EU for that, do we?
But no, the EU could be more ambitious about this. I mean, they
I would love to have more money for these kind of things, but they don't even have money for defense, so I think it's a bit acute now.
But I think the EU or the Commission, I don't know exactly, I think the EU should be a bit more courageous about, because people, and this is what you see all around Europe, I mean, there is a very strong identity crisis in Europe. I mean, people are very fearful of what's going on, and they've been fearful for many, many years. I think the EU could try at least to kind of reassure them, because otherwise we let all these voids, and this void has been filled by all kind of populists, and I think this is very dangerous, in fact, what's going on, and we'll see what's going to happen for the next elections. That this Europe is more and more anxious, I would say, about this identity. I think the EU should try to, I don't know if it's true, it's not, we don't need something which happened in the 19th century when you create, a kind of mythology, national mythology, not at all, of course, but at least to give a kind of a long, I don't know, it's not a storytelling, but it's a kind of, at least to have define a kind of a common history, I would say. You're thinking too. Everybody's thinking.
Yeah, I'm thinking.
I'd like to have the choice between a number of versions of this dream. And I think once a shared public space would offer the choice between these things, we would stop polling support for Europe. Like, you don't poll support for America. You poll support for different versions of America as put forward by the Democrats, the Republicans, and the Independent. And you think back the way Eastern Europe was absorbed into the EU, and there were a lot of choices made. For example, one choice was that we were going to create an economy in which Hungarians could take out mortgages in foreign currencies. We made all sorts of promises that it was now one market. Then the crisis 2008 happens, and suddenly all the rules were out of the window. And Hungarians ended up with mortgages that after 10 years of paying down, the mortgages was higher than it started out with. That was the outcome of choices made. And I wasn't aware those choices were made. I was never given a choice. There was no Europe-wide debate on, hey, we can have this sort of EU and we can have this sort of EU. And I think unless we begin to do that, we'll never have a vibrant public opinion. But vibrant public opinion, read Benedict Anderson, has always been around a democratic sort of power structure, which you feed as an artist, as a writer, as a thinker. And right now we're stuck on the national, and then we're sort of invited to come up with some, as a marching band, with some nice tunes for whatever the technocrats have hashed out as a compromise.
I don't represent the EU personally.
No.
But I also think we should not talk about the European dream, because Europe is, per definition, I mean, we have now 27 member states who have the power in Brussels, who decide because they want to keep the power, which is in a way very democratic, of course, but that means that we all have to compromise. And so a compromise is usually ugly, and it means that you can never get everything you want. So I think the use of the word dream, I know a lot of people are totally disillusioned with Europe. Most of them are in Brussels, by the way, because they see how things work and how everything, many things are not turning out as they had dreamt. But I mean, we're not dreaming here. We're just trying to fight our fights in Europe without waging war. Just only war with words now. But we shouldn't be so romantic about it.
Yeah.
We can be very romantic about culture. I think we can. And I think it's thriving, by the way.
Be romantic about culture.
Yes.
Not maybe speaking about romance, but speaking about compromise, and maybe the one topic we haven't discussed enough yet at this moment before we go to the audience is, of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine. And Caroline, you said that, and you wrote also in your introduction that in a way this happening made maybe Central Europe having and Eastern Europe having more in place in Ukraine, but at the same time, if you see what's happening now, I do wonder how long is it going to keep that way, because this war is going on and on. There's a lot of compromising going on. They're really asking us for help, as you said. That help is maybe not coming soon enough. And there's another thing, because we've had these questions for help before in Georgia, but also when Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, of course, was elected in Belarus, we stood there and we did nothing. So Europe, in a way, and I'm not wanting to put like a really depressive last layer on this whole evening, but it also has a tendency to really wait till the people are really I think dying.
With Georgia and Belarus, we were trying not to give the Georgians and the Belarusians too much hope, like we had done with the Ukrainians in their revolution, and we all know how that ended. Mm-hmm. So we tried not to provoke Putin, basically. Because we thought if we start supporting the Belarusians and the Georgians too much, then Putin will be provoked and he will go even further. That was a mistake, and we have, I think, totally underestimated what Putin was capable of. I mean, he said it all the time. He's very clear in what he says. He says, I want to undo the humiliation of the Gorbachev years. And I want back the pieces that belong to Tsarist to the Russian Empire. I want them back.
But if we're really concrete about
And so, we know then what he is after. And it took him, it took the big invasion in Ukraine for us to understand this. And yes, we're far behind now.
But do you think we really understand now what's at stake?
I think we understand what is at stake, but we're still afraid. And we're not prepared at all.
I think Russia, I mean, if you compare Russia to Germany during the two world wars, there are lots of similitudes, in fact. I mean, basically the Soviet Union collapsed without any invasion, but it just collapsed on itself. Then after the collapse, I mean, many parts, as we all know, went away, became independent. And then, like during the Weimar Republic, for something like 10, 12 years, you had crazy life in Russia. Like Berlin, I mean, Moscow in the 90s was like Berlin in the 20s. Everything was possible, but also lots of violence, lots of disorder. So the main Russian became fed up because some people got extremely rich, even more than extremely rich. And there was the disorder, there was the crime, there was the promiscuity, everything. So they were waiting for someone to put order in the house. And this person, of course, is Vladimir Putin. And basically, yeah, as Caroline said, Putin said exactly what he would do. I'm not comparing Putin to Hitler. This is stupid. It's just the evolution, in fact, of the two countries. Putin said what he would do, as Hitler said what he would do. And as we did with the Germans in the 30s, we said, no, we shouldn't provoke Germany, we should be careful, so we should cede Czechoslovakia or Georgia or this kind of thing. And we understood too late what he had in mind, and the main responsibles are Germany and France, especially Germany, I think. Merkel has huge historical responsibility for what happened.
And at the same time, we didn't want Germany to be too powerful. Huh?
Of course.
So, we can't have it both ways.
Sure.
Yeah.
Joris?
Yeah, so I think the European army would be one of those instances where I'm craving a vibrant European public opinion. So where we can get a sense of what the costs are, the risks are, the advantages are of having one. What kind of options do we have? I think what will happen is we sort of we could model our way into something like a war the way we modeled our way into a euro, and then we discover what we built after we built it, and we only built it halfway. I think there are some really ugly things around. If you want to be militarily independent, you need your own defense industry, and in order for that defense industry to survive, you need to export a lot of arms, usually to really ugly countries. For this, you need to bribe those leaders. And you have to have a few small-scale conflicts where you can test and showcase your weapons. The way the Brits did in Northern Ireland, the way Israel does with the Palestinians. America picks off a little Latin American country. And that is inevitable if you're going to have your own army.
But we have a lot of weapon factories in Europe, and they're all exporting. And the biggest are the Swiss, for instance, who are
but we're going to have
biggest peaceniks.
These nasty little conflicts in order to test our stuff and to show it to our prospective buyers. And so this whole idea of, if only the whole world turned European, we are parasitical on the Americans here. And if we're going to break with the Americans, we're going to become much more like the Americans. And I think it's so much better to put this up front to people before you do it, rather than to sort of do it under the carpet or over people's heads, and then sort of present them with another fait accompli.
I don't think there will ever be a European army, to be frank. Can you imagine a French commander? Let's get personal. A French commander and a couple of Dutch soldiers. I mean, if something goes wrong, the Dutch will start blaming the French. This will never work. The only thing they can do is build up their national armies, which they are currently doing, neatly within democratic terms. I mean, we're not talking about Europe here, we're talking about national armies, but at least try to buy tanks from the same brand, you know, instead of now we're all buying different tanks. So we can't help each other because these tanks have different computer systems, they have different munition, it doesn't fit. Ask the Ukrainians. They get a little bit from the Dutch, they get a little bit, not from the Belgians because they don't have anything, but from the French, also a little bit. And something from the Germans, which never works. Nothing is compatible. This is the problem in Europe. We're not talking about a European army
And
at all.
I wasn't advocating a European army. I was advocating a space in which, on the European level, we can discuss these things, and rather than having to take them as fait accompli every time.
I'm going to see if there's any questions. And in the meantime, I wanted to ask you also, because of course European elections are going up, and I'm not going to ask you to look in a glass bowl and tell me what the future is going to look like, but maybe a hope and a dream might be nice. Maybe something positive to end the evening with as well. I'm coming towards you. And please remember that thing what I said about the live stream and also not being maybe too long. Thank you.
First question is about the European demos. So, Caroline, as you were saying, you were enjoying the book fairs, young people, lots of young people during the Erasmus exchange. But who are these European demos? I think still a lot of people consider themselves European if they're academically trained, higher socio-economic backgrounds. To what extent is this European demos also people from lower economic backgrounds, especially taking into account lessons from Brexit, the somewheres versus the anywheres, people in London with thriving, vibrant lives versus the people in old mining villages. Same, I think, goes for France, Hungary, the Netherlands, what we've just seen. What can we learn from Brexit, also looking at the European elections?
Thank you.
Question for me? I think we haven't had a real European demos for a long time. But, and I'm not saying everything is perfect, and we have a big European demos now, but I mean, it's coming. It's coming because a lot of things that many people have an opinion of and they care about are becoming European, slowly, little by little. And as Joris says, often only half, so then something goes wrong and then, you know, we take a big hit. And we have all kinds of panic on the political level, and nobody finds out. I mean, this is how it often goes. But I really think a European demos is coming up. I mean, look at the Erasmus program. It's one of the best things Europe has ever done. And the good news is that the governments, for whom the trick still is to pay as little as possible into the European treasury and to get as much possible out of it, you know, in the form of subsidies and help projects and whatnot, they wanted to kill Erasmus. And actually the European Parliament has stopped this. They started making so much noise about this that a lot of people became angry. And it didn't happen in the end. I think it's good. I mean, I know some people hate it, but I mean, when you walk in Amsterdam or Maastricht, which is a small place, you know, you hear all kinds of languages. It's nice, it's good, I think. A lot of people who fled Brexit, Europeans, and I'm not just talking about academics, and you know, that's also. They moved to the Netherlands because we like speaking English. Things are.
Well English.
So do you, by the way.
Thank you.
So you know, there is a big mixture. And it's not just in the Netherlands. I lived in Vienna. Vienna is a metropolis full of nationalities and full of people who come there to study, but also to work. You know, a Hungarian repairs your roof, a Czech comes and repairs your computer. I mean, there's a lot of it. And if everybody also indicates that they want to go and vote, more and more people, it's an indication of something, you know. There's something there.
I have another question here in the back.
So I agree with Joris that to create a European demos, we should have a European media landscape. For example, have a European Netflix, and we already see that on Netflix that different European films are doing quite good, and they start to become popular on TikTok and Instagram. But do any one of you have an idea how to create that European media landscape?
Thank you.
I think so far, what we've been doing mostly is in translation. So you read a piece written by a German, directed at German readers, and then it becomes accessible to you. But that's different from what a European public opinion would be like, where a European would address his or her fellow Europeans. And so Americans do this. They write these pieces like, this morning Americans woke up to find da-da-da-da-da. And we don't have these genres even. And the same with Netflix. I don't yet see series that take Europe as its arena. It's a country, and it's very national production, and then other countries see it. But that's a different thing. It's to glue together a number of national public opinions is something quite different from having one that is superimposed over it and is legitimate in the eyes of those under it.
You know, when there's a European Council meeting, when the heads of state and government meet, you have all these journalists from all the European countries, and you have a table where all the German journalists sit, a table where all the Dutch journalists sit. Why? Because it's easier for the spokesman. So the spokesman of the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, then he just walks to one table and everybody understands what he says. So even those kind of briefings, even in Brussels, in a very European atmosphere, are totally national. I always refused, so I always sat at another table with a few other refusenicks. But you know, then your fellow countrymen start thinking you're arrogant and you don't want to sit with them. Yeah. So then you get that problem. But it's a problem.
I think we're talking about two different things. There is for half an hour now we've been talking about the EU and about Brussels and about the center. This is the EU, but there is Europe also, which is very different. I mean, if you take Arte, for instance, or if you take, there are now a few European novels, I mean, which take place in various European countries without mentioning Brussels, or you have some films which take part in different countries. Europe exists, in fact, and I think for me it's very different if we talk about Brussels or if we talk about Europe. They are two very different things. And concerning your question about European Netflix, I think if we had some idea to create a Netflix, we wouldn't be there tonight. It would be great. And this is a pity, in fact, but this is another debate about the very idea of soft power. I mean, America created this term, and they're very good, in fact, in kind of imposing without force, sometimes with force, but their very way of life and for everything. And we are very weak at this. But there are some European series. I remember, for instance, I don't know if you've seen this one, I don't watch series in general, but Babylon Berlin, for instance. This is very German, but it's very European on the other end, because Berlin at the time was the capital of Europe in the 20s. This is an example. There is a series about the European Parliament. I can't remember its title. It was broadcasted, I think, on Arte. So there are some stuff.
Yeah. And I write stories directly for European outlets as well. But it's true that not so many people do this.
And I mean, of course,
you can do it. It exists.
I mean, you have to go translation, but Umberto Eco said the language of Europe is translation. Mm-hmm. It's weird. We speak English tonight. I mean, we use, well, the Irish are still around, but we use a language. The main is out. I mean, we're using the language of a country which decided to go out.
Do you like that, or you hate it?
I mean, for me, it's fine, but it's weird. I try to. I don't speak Dutch, unfortunately. But in Italy, I speak Italian. I lived in Germany, I speak German. And when I can speak French, I speak French.
But I think it is great that we can speak English.
Yes, we have.
Because it's neutral territory now.
Somehow.
It used to be the language of one member state, but it isn't any longer. So we are free in a way. It's our lingua franca.
It is a lingua. Yeah, it's a kind of modern Latin.
It's interesting how the Arabs didn't build any of the structures like the EU, but their intellectuals, they did what the European intellectuals have utterly failed to do. There is a real Arab public opinion.
Yeah, but they have one language.
Yeah,
True.
exactly.
True, but it's
No,
they
no,
did
but
build
we
it.
have.
They did build it.
I agree with Caroline. I mean, I spend my time going from one festival to the other in many countries. So we have a debate. It exists, but we don't have a common language.
Yeah. But what I mean is that if you follow Arab public opinion, there is such a thing as the Arab public opinion that people feed into, and that also becomes a sort of a pressure group of its own, and so it's striking that if the political process is absent, the intellectuals do build something.
But what you see now with European outlets, media outlets, they're all in English.
Yeah,
They translate too, but the main language is English.
True.
I have two more questions that I'm going to take in all at once, and then I'm coming to join you back at the table. And just one, I would always say, you don't speak Dutch yet.
Very good point.
You never know.
I would also not recommend to learn it, but I have a different question. I know it's maybe not a popular opinion, but some would say that the public sphere for debate is now social media. And even though it's constructed in bubbles and in different platforms, could you maybe reflect on how social media is maybe shaping this public sphere of opinion making, however impeded and negative some of them are?
Thank you. I'm going all the way to the front because there's one more question.
Hi, thank you. I've got a question for all three speakers tonight. Looking to the future, would you welcome very strong, powerful, but also charismatic leadership? So one strong leader representing Europe, remembering our past with strong leaders, of course, but also acknowledging our need to have a counterweight, for example, to put in or to have one answer to represent Europe.
I love that one.
So maybe we can do one closing round, and then I'm going to ask you to answer this last question about this big leader, say something about the European election, and maybe involve the question of social media.
Oh,
sorry, it's really...
Shall I start?
Yes.
I think social media are good and they are also bad. I mean, some outlets are completely polluted, but you find a lot of interesting stuff precisely from, other people whom you would otherwise not meet and who give you ideas or suggest articles that otherwise I would have never read. So I try to use it so I can, have the best stuff and leave the shit behind. I don't always manage, but yeah. So, but it is also a factor in the Europeanization of the public sphere. About the leaders, I remember it was perhaps in the year 2000 or something, they built a new IKEA in Brussels. And they didn't have a real street or sidewalks yet, and it was raining like hell. And on a Sunday, I needed to get one of these Billy bookcases. So I go there, and I see the car next to me stops, and the guy comes out, and it's Romano Prodi. He was the president of the European Commission. Small Italian man. Nobody knew who he was, of course, at the time, except the Italians, because he had been prime minister. So I followed Romano Prodi. First we land in the mud. You get out of your car and full of mud. He too. So, and you have to zigzag through that IKEA. So I followed him all the way. Nobody noticed this guy. Nobody recognized him. I think if now we would let Ursula von der Leyen loose in the IKEA, sidewalks or not, everybody would recognize her. But at the same, which is good. Because sometimes we want somebody who, speaks on... you need people to identify with. I was talking to one of these Habsburgers for my book, and he said, well, the EU is the same as the Habsburg Empire, except, we had the emperor, no? But at the same time, we don't need too much of an emperor either. because that would be a dictatorship. You know, a very strong European leader, I'm sure it's not acceptable for anybody. And that's a good thing, in my view. So it's somewhere halfway. Does that work?
I bumped into Romano Prodi last week in Rome, actually. It's not so short. She didn't bump into Romano Prodi, he's taller. He was also alone, actually, and no one will recognize him in the street of Rome.
Okay. He's much older now.
Yes, he is. But he was very happy that I would recognize him.
Good, you did.
Leadership. I don't know, I'm a big... I like François-Joseph a lot, actually, but it would be difficult to have François-Joseph today. Where would he come from? From which family? And
he was certainly not elected.
He was not. And he only stayed in power 68 years, I think.
Yeah, 86.
Yeah.
68, you're
68,
right. Yes.
Yeah, 68.
Yes, 68.
I mean, I hate social media. I think it makes people completely crazy, and it's. I mean, they understand. I mean, the people who launched it, they understood how the human psyche works, in fact. And I think, even if it's interesting sometimes, and you can learn, or maybe you got in touch with your girlfriend of 30 years ago. In general, I would say if they didn't exist, I think we would be better somehow. But that's another question. Leadership, it's well, what is lacking is a strong symbolic, maybe not a figure, not a human body, but I don't know, something more that's a flag with 12 stars or a Beethoven anthem. We need stronger symbols. I don't know which one they can be, but people have to identify more with the European adventure, I would say. And let's put it as an adventure, because it's an adventure because no one knows how it's going to end. And there is no clear end, in fact. So every year is different. It leads to something else. I think there was a third question, wasn't it?
About the elections, but you can skip it.
No, I want to
organize
answer.
a new evening.
Yeah.
No, of course.
We will do that, of course, running up to the elections. But if you want to say something, please feel free.
No, I only hope that the figures you gave will be confirmed. I have doubts about it because
Well, the real turnout is always lower than the intention, of course. That was the same last time. 58% said a year before they had the intention. In the end, 52% went to vote, which was already 10% more than last time. So even if it's 10%, even if it's like 60% goes and vote, it's already a lot more than last time, which tells you something. Quand même.
Oui.
Yeah.
Joris, final word?
So social media, I think, very good for campaigning. And I mean, imagine a world without Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and LGBTQ movement. All of that has really grown out of social media, because traditional media are all controlled by men like me, and we are white straight male. And so I think it's very good at campaigning. But it's quite fragmented, and I think it's less well suited to crystallizing into a kind of consensus. So it's by its nature it's more fragmented and fragmenting, I think, than finally helping a population arrive at a sense of, well, we all had our say and now we're going to go for this rather than that course of action. I think in that sense, mass media are by definition sort of the mass instruments for that. Charismatic leader, I think they used this in the Arab world. They always said, we have strong men and weak institutions, and the West has weak men and strong institutions. So charisma means that you stop thinking. And so it's really, I really worry. I've been raised with the idea that the most dangerous thing you can have in politics is charismatic people who do really well on TV. And the last election in the Netherlands, our so-called doubters, all they cared about is who did best on TV.
Yeah.
I find this terrifying, because you're basically replacing making the case, even if you look dull, to being cool. And that's the world of Boris Johnson. You will always lose to the Boris Johnsons once charisma becomes important. Any more somber, morose, pessimistic misery? No, I think I'm done.
That's okay. Then I'm going to say thank you to you all for being here. Joris Luyendijk, Caroline de Gruyter and Olivier Guez. Thank you. I really understand you have to go, but I wanted to say one more thing, two more things. Kees Fukema, thank you for making the program. And the book is for sale. Please buy it because it's beautiful and really touching. And will you be around to sign it if people appreciate it?
Maybe, yeah.
Could be. I like that. Yeah. It's a good answer to a very insightful evening. A bit of suspense. Yeah. Thank you all very much and hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.